Hello, my name is Chelsea Litchfield and I'm from Sturt University in Australia. The title of my presentation today is She's on a Hat Trick, Media, Money and Fame in Women's Sports in Australia. Now, the purpose of this presentation really is, I guess, just to present some ideas that I had around this particular area. By no means have I completed all of the research, but certainly I've noticed that there have been a lot more women's sports and certainly women athletes present in media context in Australia recently. I kind of wanted to investigate what that looked like in terms of remuneration, i.e. how much they're being paid, and whether there actually was an increase in media coverage and whether that media coverage was positive. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, and I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll keep going. There's no surprise for anyone, hopefully, when I say that female athletes and female sports have certainly lagged behind men in media coverage in Australia. When there is coverage of female athletes, there are also fairly persistent themes about how the women athletes are presented. For example, they're often presented in ways that infantilizes, heterosexualizes them, and also the traditional femininity of those particular athletes is certainly a feature in any type of media coverage. In terms of payments or remuneration, women athletes have been paid significantly less than male athletes in all sports in Australia. In fact, when I was writing this presentation, I couldn't really think of any sport where women were being paid more than men. I don't think that exists. But there are a few exceptions in this space, and certainly the Grand Slams in tennis are certainly an exception, particularly when women and men are paid the same amount. So I've done some preliminary research around what broadcasting looks like of women's sporting events and also the remuneration packages for women in Australian sport. Now, these are statistics from 2018, and I'm focusing on particular two events. The women's cricket event, which is a domestic competition called the Women's Big Bash League in Australia, and also the Australian rules football event for women athletes, and that's called the AFLW competition, or Australian Football League Women's. For the WBBL cricket event, basically in 2018, 23 of the 59 matches that will be held will be broadcast on free-to-air television. Now, this sounds like a remarkable statistic, having nearly half of the matches broadcast on television. However, if we were to compare it to the men's competition, which is the BBL, Big Bash League, we would see that nearly all of the matches are broadcast on television. And there's also some certain issues around the timing of those matches as well, which I'll unpack a little bit later. In terms of Australian rules football, or the AFLW event, all of the matches are broadcast on pay television, which sounds very impressive. But again, I will unpack that a little bit later in terms of why they're perhaps held on television and the scheduling of those events, and certainly up to 2 on free-to-air television each week. There's a couple of other statistics there around two of the other sports that are quite big in Australia for women, Suncorp Super Netball and the Soccer W League, or soccer or football, depending on where you are from in the world. I'll let you have a look at those. But in terms of remuneration for those two specific sports, cricket and AFL, we see that in cricket for females, in 2018, the base salary for a female athlete or female cricketer is 72,000 Australian dollars. Previously, or the previous year, was 40,000 Australian dollars. So there's been a really big jump, and that's corresponded with the jump in payments for male cricketers as well. In terms of the AFLW, the base salary for a senior player is $10,500. The previous year was $8,500. So there's again been a small jump, not a significant jump, but certainly a small jump in what women were being paid previously. So what have these changes meant for women's sports in Australia and certainly female athletes? I think there's certainly been an increased visibility of women athletes and women's elite level sporting competitions of late. This has been evident with television programming. It's certainly been evident with broader sports media coverage as well. Women are certainly more recognisable, certainly more high profile, and some certainly also enjoy the celebrity that's often associated only with male athletes in Australia. But I would suggest that this doesn't perhaps apply to all female athletes playing in their sports. In fact, I would suggest that it only applies to those who are perhaps successful or stand out or do well. So, that's certainly something that needs to be unpacked a lot further. However, we know that the reality of the situation is that the differences between male and female athletes in Australia are still quite significant. For example, women athletes are still certainly paid significantly less than male athletes in their respective sports. So if we were to go back and have a little look at cricket, we would see that the base salary for a male international player, so a player that plays for Australia, is around 278,000 Australian dollars. We know from a couple of slides ago that the base salary for a female international player is around 72,000. So even though female athletes have certainly taken giant strides forward in terms of what they're being paid in the last couple of years, there's certainly still that really big disparity between male and female cricketers. The other example that I talked about earlier is Australian rules football, and we know that the average player salary for men playing in the AFL is 371,000 Australian dollars, so very big salary. The average salary or the average contract between for a female player in the AFLW is between 8,500 and 20,000 Australian dollars. So a really big difference. And you can see there's another example regarding soccer or football domestic competitions as well. But I also want to raise a couple of other issues. And the first one is that the broadcast times and dates for women's sporting competitions often don't interfere with male events. And I think this is part of the reason why we've seen an increase in media coverage of female athletes and certainly female sporting competitions in the last couple of years. For example, the AFLW competition is actually held in 8 weeks prior to the men's competition even beginning. So therefore there's not that competition for broadcast times, prime time viewing, those sorts of things. So it's held at a completely different in a completely different time period. In terms of cricket, we often see that there isn't a female match played in prime time slots or either. We're seeing the women's matches that are broadcast played around lunchtime or in the mid-afternoon. Now, as you can imagine, that's quite a really hot time of the year for the Australian summer. And again, these are just again not interfering with the male events. So I think that certainly needs to be unpacked a lot further. And we're also only seeing some women athletes enjoy this celebrity that's associated with their sporting success. And I've touched on that slightly, a little bit on the previous slide. But what I mean by that is we're still seeing those appropriately feminine type athletes, female athletes, that are the ones that are being called up to go through interviews, invited onto television programs, interviewed for sports media pieces and those sorts of things. So we're still not seeing a lot of diversity in that space, and I think that's certainly another issue that needs to be unpacked further, and certainly something I'll be doing in the paper that I'll be submitting. So thank you for listening. I hope you've learnt something.